Hello, and welcome to Your Estate Matters with your hosts, my colleague Greg Brenand and myself, Nicole Garten of Heritage Trust.
Your Estate Matters is a podcast dedicated to everything estates, including building and preserving your legacy.
If it's estate related, we'll be talking about it. We're having the conversations today that will help Canadians protect their families, their assets, and their legacies tomorrow. So Grant, thank you so much for being here with us today and to talk about family wealth and legacy building. So why don't you tell us about yourself and how you got into this field?
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So, a bit about myself. Originally, I'm from the UK, and I followed my older brother's footsteps into the city, which is the financial area of London. And I spent 17 years working on the equity markets or in equity markets on a big trading floor, banks of screens. I loved the pace of it and became addicted to the markets, kind of loved the markets. I then went to Las Vegas for 4 days and ended up in Vancouver. So just for clarification, that wasn't some hangover drugging type incident. I actually met my wife, my now wife, who's from Vancouver.
Wonderful.
And how I got into this field, I guess, so when I moved to Vancouver, I guess the way to think about it is I was gifted the opportunity to work in wealth management. And so that was at Genus, and it's where my mother-in-law was one of the co-founders of Genus originally. And I very quickly learned that it was more than just returns and markets in wealth management. I think one of the things that helped me a lot was I was fortunate enough to do the FEA program, Family Enterprise Advisor program. And that was in my first year. And so it just changed my outlook to more of a family focus outlook when I started in wealth management. And there's quite a crossover between family wealth and family enterprise that sort of applied to both. And I think building on that, I was quite conscious of nepotism when I started, and then I was trying to add value through something different and started looking at family wealth more holistically, kind of broadening the concept of it to understanding like the purpose of it and what it meant for families and even just what wealth was. So it's been an 8-year period of growth, moving to a new city, having children, new career, and just becoming a lot more self-aware.
And that's how we met.
Yes.
So we're both graduates of the Family Enterprise Advisor program, and we have commonalities in terms of the substantive knowledge and our interest in business families and successful succession and wealth across generations.
Yeah. And I know it's not an advert, but I can highly recommend it to anyone who's thinking about it. It's,
Well, as a follow-up to that, Grant, what does the concept of wealth mean to you?
Yeah, so it's interesting with this question. I actually sat down and thought about this a little bit, and it's been a lifelong journey. I used to just think of wealth as money and as a destination, and once you got there, everything was going to be easy. Jay Hughes teaches that wealth is more than just financial capital, more than just money. He includes intellectual capital, social capital, spiritual capital, and human capital. Others have identified various things along the same sort of theme. But the idea is to look at it a little bit more holistically. I think society as a whole just tends to think of it as financial capital. Thinking of it more broadly, it reframes the concept and what it represents, and then it also reframes how you might grow it, how you might steward it, and changes the focus just away from financial returns. And I think a lot of people on some level kind of feel this or know that they're missing something if they're purely focusing on the financial returns, but don't always have the vocabulary to understand what it is they're missing or the guidance. I mean, the premise of Jay's teachings is that to be truly wealthy, you need to tend to all of those capitals and not just the financial capital. Just as an anecdote, the etymology of the word wealth, I don't know if anyone has been as geeky as me to Google it, but it comes from the Old English word will, meaning well-being, and then it's combined with health. And so the original word wealth was nothing to do with financial capital.
So that's so interesting. So how do you build successful wealth stewardship?
That's $1 million question. And I think it doesn't start necessarily just with a start button. It's not a process that you can just suddenly press play on and plug in and go. I just finished a book called The Gift of Lift by David York, and in there he actually identifies stewards as people that are outwardly focused, they're driven by purpose, they're deeply invested, and they're looking to try and move the ball down the field, to borrow a football analogy. And it's interesting, he terms it that it requires investment and transcendence. And so the investment part is learning about yourself, about others, about stewardship, and then transcendence is going beyond just you and out into the bigger picture and how that works and how that fits in. And when you stop thinking solely about yourself, I think there's a lot more chance of getting effective stewardship. So when you're trying to impart that for the next generation, I mean, this can start at a really young age. Like if you're building empathy in children and you're encouraging outward focus, volunteering, all of those things can start to be the nuggets or the building blocks of that stewardship going forwards, as well as just education around what the wealth represents, the communication around why it's being passed down, how it was created, just to create more connection to the wealth, as opposed to it's just this financial money that I've been given and then I can go do what I want with it. There's a bit more meaning to it. So I think stewardship is a word that's used a lot, and I think it means different things to different people, but it effectively, most matriarchs use it in terms of don't blow my money or don't blow the money. So I think trying to cultivate that you can start at a really young age, and it's lots of different things, including values, and just different characteristics to try and build in the heirs.
So are you doing that with your own children?
I try. It's a little bit concerning because I've done reading around we all have a relationship to money, and we transmit money messages, and children, a lot of our beliefs around all things are formed sub the age of 10. And so children are just sponges to pick up those beliefs, and beliefs around money and wealth and stewardship and all these things are picked up. So you try and be intentional, but I think it's really difficult to capture everything. And then there's the environment they're in as well. So you just hope they're in a good environment as well. So where possible, we try to engender gratitude in the children by either appreciating what they've got, and that's difficult because if you try to explain to a child, you're lucky, they don't really get that, but also by maybe witnessing others that don't have as much. We have a tradition at Christmas of going down to Granville Island and you pick a name off the tree for a child that's maybe not going to get as many presents, and the kids choose one for them. So yeah, there's lots of things. I think at a younger age, and I should clarify, my kids are 8.5, 7, 8.5, 6.5, and just turned 4. So trying to engender or trying to create that empathy, that understanding, that gratitude, that can all go towards the building blocks of stewardship for the future.
So amazing. So there's we hear a lot in the news about wealth transfer and the graying of society and baby boomers getting older. So what are the statistics of wealth transfer and business succession in Canada? Yeah,
so I often cringe when I hear someone give a definitive number on this subject. But I mean, if you Google it, there's huge numbers. The dollars, billions or trillions across North America. Businesses, there's just tons of businesses that are going to transfer or transition in the next 10 years. So in some senses, I kind of feel that the size of the overall transfer is somewhat irrelevant to an individual family because they're focused on their own situation. But I think it is a different and new environment. We've never faced this amount of wealth transfer before. And there's more of a concentration of wealth now in those generations that are coined either the silent generation or boomers. So it's different to previous generation. And I think it requires a slightly different approach. And whereas some people may have inherited just through a sort of big reveal where they sit down and they get told the instructions of the deceased, and that was the way it's done it. I think now that can be done differently. So I don't know if you guys have watched The Gentleman on Netflix, a TV show. So it's kind of fun. It's a UK show, but there's one point whereby the father, who was the Duke of somewhere or other, has passed away, and the family are gathered round for the big reveal, and the lawyer's there and doing. And for generations and hundreds of years, it's just been primogeniture, and so the eldest son's there, expecting to inherit everything, and everyone's sad about. There's a lawyer who is as grey as can be and as dull as can be, just standing there reading out. And as he reads through it, it doesn't go the way that it was expected, without ruining too much of the show. And then the fallout is kind of comical. It's also kind of scary, and in some ways, I think it encapsulates possibly a different way of doing things. Could be better. If you watch it, you'll see what I'm talking about. But I think with the wealth transfer that's going on in the next decade or however long, it's new, it's different, and I think it requires a new and a different approach to dealing with it.
It's funny you should bring up the English example, because when I administer estates, I always say to people, it's not like you see, where the family sits there in the morning, the will's read, and in the afternoon it's distributed.
Yeah.
It's several years in some cases. So what would you say, Grant, are the successful keys to a successful succession planning?
If I could nail those, I'd be retired somewhere. But I think first off, and you've identified this in your previous podcast, having a plan is a big key to the successful succession planning. And it's kind of scary to me how many people either feel they don't need one or they'll just do it next year. But yeah, so I think the main points I would say that can help are communication, education, some sort of form decision making around it, and then a sort of bunch of points together is purpose, identity, love, and gratitude. And I don't think those are normally included when people come to succession planning. On the communication, I think there's so I once attended this class, I guess, or educational thing, and we were asked to design a backpack. And so it was like, draw it on a piece of paper. It's like, easy, great. So I drew this backpack, and then we all held them up and showed them. And it was a backpack for one of the presenters or one of the people. And so the one thing that nobody did was ask any questions about what the backpack was to do. Was it to go skiing? Was it for the beach? Was it did it need to be waterproof? Did it need to be big? Did it need to be small, day pack, whatever? And so it kind of comes to form and function. And so I think everything on the planet, pretty much, it's designed with a function in mind. So usually people start with function and then they go to form. And so I think that's really important. So the communication part of it, I see as the function. So the form, the structure, I think, that's very well taken care of. But communicating the structure and communicating the form and why it's like that, or being able to communicate around it. So it doesn't necessarily mean let's chat numbers. I think a lot of people are worried about entitlement or demotivating potential heirs. But sharing of intentions and dreams, what the thinking was behind the plan, even why you're leaving anything to heirs. I mean, you look at Warren Buffett or you look at some other people, and I guess a few examples that I've come across, like if you're using a trust structure, which I know you guys are very familiar with, communicate why a trust. And so I've seen examples where it feels like the trust was done to them, not for them. And introducing the beneficiaries to trustees ahead of time, communicating some kind of compass. There's lots of communication bits that could be done. And also real estate's the other common one we see. So real estate jointly left to heirs, just explaining why that is happening, and maybe even get the recipient's input around that.
You mentioned purpose, identity, love, and gratitude. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So tell us more about that.
All of this planning generally is done with love, and it generally has a purpose. I think people worry about the identity of the heirs being altered by receiving some wealth or some assets or whatever it is. And I think gratitude seems to be one of the things that can kind of negate entitlement a little bit. Like if somebody is truly grateful for something, they tend not to be entitled about it. So if there is a way to communicate the purpose of the funds and why you're doing this, and if you can infuse that with love and maybe help support the identity of the heirs, and then even sow some seeds of gratitude into it, so as that can build over time. One thing on my learning journey that I've come across is an organization called Purposeful Planning Institute out of the US, and they do 7 keys to purposeful trusts, and one of the keys is having little text boxes in the trust document to sow seeds of gratitude, to just capture a memory or capture some connection to make it feel a little bit more personal. And I think when it comes to successful succession planning, going back to the form and function, the form, the structure, it's never the issue. I think it's the function, the communication around that, even the education possibly of the recipients, but then it's all those other bits that can help it be more successful.
Going on that, do you find for transition or succession planning that it's more successful if younger people are exposed to wealth earlier, so it's not a lump sum at some greater, at some later date, that they understand responsibility of money and management of it?
I think that comes under education for me, and I it's hard to know what the right amount is, but I don't think most people would take a newly qualified driver and hand them the keys to a Ferrari. They would want them to start on a Honda Civic and work their way up. And I think it can be thought of along the same lines. You need to learn to test drive the wealth or how to drive it safely and responsibly before you maybe just get everything in one lump sum. People have different, I guess everyone is different, and people have different things, different views on it in terms of there's a certain age where people are responsible or there's certain milestones. But I think in my experience or from what I've read, there's a few things. One is we're still forming our identities as individuals and until well into our 30s. And you really want people to form, I think most parents or gifters would want the heirs to form their own identities unencumbered and unaffected by some of the gifts that they're going to receive. But it can be supportive. So if it can help their lives through that, there's no reason not to give something to help support their lives and increase their well-being. So if it's additive in some way, so that could be paying for their accommodation, whether at university or having them have healthcare, making sure they've got enough to eat well, various things. But I think, my opinion, it's slow and steady and it's a gradual process. And again, I've been trying to bring financial education to my kids, and there's actually Sesame Street financial skits, or they do, which is pretty good. There's lots of resources out there, but it's kind of hard, and especially now as we move away from cash, it's even harder because the allowance becomes less. Like we never have cash to give the allowance, so it's kind of a little bit more tricky. So it is a changing world. I do think it's good to build that education from an early age, and I do personally feel that it's good to road test a little bit and to make that a gradual climb in terms of financial assets and responsibility.
So we're talking a lot about the responsibilities of inheritors and building wealth stewardship, but of course there's also a lot of inequity in the world, and these are, I guess, issues of the 1%, and so children of families that have the privilege and opportunity of wealth, do you think they have responsibility in that regard to the huge swaths of humanity that have less wealth? And by wealth, I mean not just financial, but less social supports, less intellectual capital, all those lacks that affect full human flourishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, again, comes back to that empathy and gratitude and exposure at a younger age to realize that the world isn't a flat, equal place, and there are inequalities that are out there. And it sort of steps into philanthropy as well, and encouraging that giving from an early age and understanding what that means. There's been research done on different types of inheritors. So I think it's the Merrill Family Center of Wealth have done these various different inheritors. And sometimes when wealth is passed down, people can feel guilty about it. They don't deserve it. They didn't earn it. And all they want to do is give it away. And so that is kind of useful in terms of supporting not-for-profits and charities and good causes out there. But it's also not necessarily a responsible approach to the wealth and how it was, what it was intended. But I do think it can be used in that way. And with Genus, we do impact investing, and that is another way that people are actually responsibly using their wealth to try and create a positive impact in the world. Mm-hmm. So it used to be that we kind of had investing and you had charity giving, which can also almost be thought of sort of as concessionary investing. You expect some sort of return, but you don't expect any financial return. Mm-hmm. So that impact, I think, is becoming a bigger thing. And I think for the generations, there does seem to be more empathy and a wider awareness in the younger generations today about the responsibilities of wealth and the inequalities. And it feels to me that inequality is growing, and it's probably got more stretched now than at most other points in time. I seem to remember years ago seeing some chart around the inequalities of wealth, and we were back to like late 1920s era of inequalities. But it was... So it is important, and I think that comes down to stewardship. So stewardship doesn't just mean taking the wealth and not spending it. It just means using it correctly, looking after it, and doing something positive with it.
So what do you mean by impact investing? Is that the same as ESG or?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different terms. I would classify it. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance, and that is a lens with which you can look through at investments. So you can look at any investment through those three categories and see how it ranks or how it does on those different things. Impact investing is generally thought of, and again, everyone seems to have their own definition of this. It's generally thought of as an investment that, whilst potentially getting a financial return, is also seeking a positive impact. And around 2016-17, the UN came out with Sustainable Development Goals. I think there's 17 of them. And typically now the world has kind of coalesced around those Sustainable Development Goals, and the impact is measured as coming under one of those things. So that could be clean water, it could be healthcare, it could be education, renewable energy. There's various different ones. And so impact investing tends to be a focus on a positive outcome, whereas ESG investing is not necessarily a positive outcome. It's just understanding the environmental, social, and governance components of the investment you're making. And it could be that you're focused on purely making environmental, and so that means you exclude some others. So I think that's slightly different. The impact one is more, I would say, towards the charitable side of things in terms of trying to make a positive impact on a topic.
Well, are there any final tips or best practices for families who wish to build and preserve wealth?
So in terms of building the wealth, I'm not so sure. In terms of preserving wealth, I think it's just being positive around it. So I guess I've highlighted a little bit of the fears on this, and I think there is a lot of fear-driven sales done around this, or fear-driven advice. But a lot of people just want to successfully give financial assets down, some human, some social capital, and they just want to give their heirs the best opportunity. So I think in terms of advice or recommendations, I think just get curious, be open, look to do things a little differently. There's no rules around this. I know there is a structure and there are practices, but there's no rules where you go outside of that. And just be open and embrace the unknown. I think, yeah, really, the real gift is the gift of love. And I think that's what everyone's trying to give and trying to do.
Well, Grant, thank you so much. This has been amazing. You've been very knowledgeable, and I think this is going to be a great benefit to our listeners.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered individual legal, financial, or tax advice. Make sure to consult the advisor of your choice to advise you on your own circumstances. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your Estate Matters. If you like this podcast, make sure to follow it on your podcast platform of choice.
Whether you are planning your own estate or you're acting as executor for somebody else's, Heritage Trust can help. Partner with Heritage Trust to protect your family, your assets, and your legacy.
If you would like more information about Heritage Trust, please visit our website at heritagetrustcompany.ca.
This podcast is produced by Podfather Creative.